September 1957. Humes High School in Memphis, Tennessee was buzzing with excitement about the upcoming football game for the blind. The E.H. Crump Memorial Football Game was a beloved tradition, raising money to help visually impaired children across the city. Every student wanted to go, but there was a problem that nobody wanted to talk about. The ticket cost 50 cents. And in 1957 Memphis, 50 cents was the difference between eating lunch for a week and watching a football game. Principal T.C. Brindley stood in his office, looking at the numbers, his heart sinking. Out of 1,400 students at Humes High, only about 200 could afford tickets. That meant 1,200 students would be left behind, watching their classmates go to the game while they stayed home too ashamed to admit their families couldn't spare 50 cents. Then Elvis Presley, the school's most famous graduate who had left just 4 years earlier, heard about the problem. What he did next would teach those 1,400 students a lesson about dignity that would last longer than any classroom lecture. But to understand why Elvis would spend over $1,000 on football tickets for students he'd never met, you need to know what it was like to be poor at Humes High School in the early 90s. You need to know about the shame Elvis carried, the exclusions he experienced, and the promise he'd made to himself about the kind of person he would become if he ever had the chance. It was 1953, and 15-year-old Elvis Presley sat in the back of his history class at Humes High School, trying to make himself invisible. His shirt was clean but worn thin from washing. His pants were a size too small because he'd grown over the summer, and his family couldn't afford new ones. His shoes had cardboard stuffed inside to cover the holes in the soles. Elvis had learned to be invisible. Poor kids at Humes developed that skill early. You didn't volunteer answers in class because that drew attention. You didn't make eye contact with the popular kids because that invited comparison. You ate your free lunch quickly in a corner of the cafeteria where people wouldn't notice the reduced price stamp on your meal ticket. But being invisible only worked until something happened that required money. That's when the shame became unavoidable. The spring field trip to Nashville was announced in April. 50 cents per student, optional but encouraged. Elvis watched as his classmates eagerly signed up, chattering about seeing the Grand Ole Opry, about staying in a real hotel, about eating at restaurants. He said nothing. He took the permission slip home and put it in a drawer, never mentioning it to his parents. He knew what 50 cents meant in the Presley household. It meant his father working an extra shift. It meant his mother skipping meals to stretch the grocery budget. When the day of the trip arrived, Elvis stayed home and told his mother he had a headache. She looked at him with knowing, sad eyes but said nothing. They both understood the real reason. That experience was repeated dozens of times throughout Elvis's years at Humes. The class ring he couldn't afford, the prom ticket that was beyond, the graduation cap and gown rental that had to be borrowed from a cousin. Each exclusion was small, barely noticeable to the students who could participate. But to Elvis, each one reinforced the same message. You don't quite belong here. The worst part wasn't the missing out. The worst part was pretending it was a choice. I don't want to go to Nashville anyway, Elvis would say. Dances aren't my thing. I prefer to skip graduation ceremonies. The lies became automatic, a shield against pity and judgment. But there was one teacher at Humes who saw through Elvis's invisibility. Mrs. Mildred Scrivener taught English and directed the school's annual talent show. She noticed the quiet boy in the back row who hummed to himself during study period, who tapped rhythms on his desk, who seemed to come alive when music played during assemblies. In the spring of 1953, Mrs. Scrivener announced the annual Humes High Talent Show. $5 entry fee to participate, with proceeds going to the school band fund. Elvis felt the familiar clench in his stomach. He desperately wanted to perform. Music was the one thing that made him feel like he mattered, like he had something valuable to offer. But $5 was impossible. Mrs. Scrivener found Elvis after class one day. I noticed you didn't sign up for the talent show, she said. Elvis shrugged, aiming for casual indifference. Not really interested. That's funny, Mrs. Scrivener said. Because every time there's music playing, you're the most interested person in the room. Elvis said nothing. The entry fee is waived for students who help with setup and teardown, Mrs. Scrivener continued, as if she was just mentioning a random. We need someone to arrange chairs and help with the sound system. It's work, But if you're willing to do it, you can perform. Elvis looked up at her, understanding what she was really offering. A way to participate without charity. A way to belong without I can do that, he said quietly. Elvis performed at that talent show, singing and playing guitar. He didn't win, but standing on that stage, seeing his classmates actually look at him, actually listen to him, something shifted. For the first time at Humes High School, Elvis wasn't invisible. He wasn't the poor kid. He was just a kid with talent. Mrs. Scrivener's small act of dignity, offering work instead of pity, stayed with Elvis. Years later, when he became famous, he would remember how she'd given him a way to participate without taking away his pride. Elvis graduated from Humes High School in June 9. By all accounts, he was forgettable. Not in the honor society, not on the football team, not voted most likely to succeed. He was just another poor kid from North Memphis, who managed to finish high school, which itself was an achievement in a community where many students dropped out to work. But Elvis made himself a promise on graduation day. If he ever made it, if he ever had money, if he ever escaped the crushing weight of poverty, he would remember what it felt like to be excluded. He would remember the shame of pretending you didn't want things you desperately wanted, and he would do something about it. 4 years later, Elvis had kept the first part of that promise. He'd made it. In 1957, Elvis Presley was the biggest star in America. His records dominated the charts. His concerts sold out in minutes. His movies made millions. He'd bought his mother the house she'd always dreamed of, Graceland, and filled it with everything his family had never been able to afford. But Elvis hadn't forgotten the second part of his promise. He hadn't forgotten what it felt like to be the kid who couldn't afford to participate. In September 1957, Elvis was visiting Memphis, between concert tours, when he ran into an old classmate from Humes, Bobby Henderson. They'd known each other slightly in school, both quiet kids who kept to themselves. Bobby was now working at a gas station, pumping fuel and changing oil, making ends meet. "How's things at Humes?" Elvis asked as Bobby filled his Cadillac's tank. Bobby shrugged. "Same as always. Big football game coming up for the blind kids. You remember those E.H. Crump Memorial Games?" Elvis remembered. Those charity games had been happening since before he attended Humes. Annual events where the school community came together to raise money for blind children in Memphis. "That's still going on?" "Yeah, but there's talk this year might be the last one," Bobby said, checking the oil. "Not enough interest. Turns out most kids can't afford the 50 cents for tickets. School's trying to decide if they should cancel or just let the kids who can pay go." Elvis went very still. "How many kids are we talking about?" "Whole school's got about 1,400 students. Maybe 200 will be able to go. The rest..." Bobby trailed off with a shrug that said everything about how poor kids in Memphis just accepted exclusion as normal. Elvis felt something hot and tight in his chest. He was back in that classroom, pretending he didn't want to go to Nashville. Back in the cafeteria, hiding his free lunch stamp. Back in all those moments when poverty meant invisibility. "What if someone bought tickets for all of them?" Elvis asked. Bobby laughed. "That'd be 1,400 tickets. 50 cents each. That's what, $700? $1,050, Elvis said immediately. He'd done the math in his head the second Bobby mentioned the number of students. For 1,400 tickets. Bobby looked at him. "You're not serious." "Why wouldn't I be?" "Elvis, that's a lot of money. And half those kids don't even know who you are. They're just freshmen and sophomores who started after you graduated." "So," Elvis said, "they go to Humes. That's enough." The next morning, Elvis called Principal T.C. Brindley. Brindley had been a teacher when Elvis was a student, recently promoted to principal. He remembered Elvis as one of the quiet ones, not a troublemaker but not particularly memorable either. "Mr. Brindley, this is Elvis Presley," Elvis said when the principal answered. There was a pause. Even in 1957, Elvis's name carried weight. "Elvis? Well, this is a surprise. What can I do for you?" "I heard about the E.H. Crump Memorial Game," Elvis said. "Heard not all the students can afford to go." Brindley sighed. "That's true. It's a shame, really. It's meant to be a school community event, but the ticket price, even though it's just 50 cents, is too much for many of our families. We're trying to figure out the best approach. How many students you got at Humes now? About 1,400 enrolled this semester. I want to buy tickets for all of them, Elvis said. Every single student. Nobody gets left out. Brindley was quiet for so long that Elvis thought they'd been disconnected. Then he heard the principal's voice, thick with emotion. Elvis, that's over $1,000. I know, $1,050 for 1,400 tickets. I'll have my manager send a check today. But why? Brindley asked. Most of these students don't even know you. You graduated 4 years ago. Why would you do this? Elvis thought about Miss Scrivener offering him work so he could perform without charity. He thought about hiding his free lunch stamp. He thought about pretending he didn't want to go to Nashville. Because nobody should be left out, Elvis said simply. Nobody should have to pretend they don't want to go to something just because they can't afford it. These kids deserve better than that. Memphis deserves better than that. Brindley was crying now. This will mean everything to them. You understand that, right? For some of these students, this will be the first time they've been included in something like this. The first time they haven't had to watch from the sidelines. Good, Elvis said. That's how it should be. Every time. The check arrived at Humes High School the next $1,050 from Elvis Presley, earmarked for E.H. Crump Memorial Game tickets. Principal Brindley called an emergency assembly. 1,400 students filed into the Humes High Auditorium on a September afternoon, confused about the sudden gathering. Teachers looked puzzled. Even the faculty didn't know what was happening. Principal Brindley walked onto the stage and waited for the noise to settle. I have an announcement about the E.H. Crump Memorial football game, he began. The auditorium went quiet. The students who couldn't afford tickets shifted uncomfortably in their seats, expecting bad news. Maybe the game was canceled. Maybe they were about to be publicly reminded of what they couldn't have. As you know, the game raises money for blind children in our community. Brindley continued. It's an important tradition, one that reflects the best values of Humes High School. This year, we had a problem. Many of you couldn't afford the 50-cent ticket price. The uncomfortable shifting increased. Some students stared at their lap. This was it, the public acknowledgement of their poverty. But yesterday I received a phone call, Brindley said, his voice growing stronger. From someone who graduated from this school 4 years ago. Someone who remembered what it was like to be a student here. Someone who understands that our community takes care of its own. The students looked up, curious now. Elvis Presley has purchased tickets for every single student in this school, Brindley announced. All 1,400 of you. Every freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior. Everyone goes to the game. Nobody gets left behind. The auditorium exploded. Students jumped to their feet, screaming, cheering, crying. Teachers wiped their eyes. In the back rows, the students who had resigned themselves to staying home, who had prepared their excuses about not wanting to go, who had practiced their invisible shame, suddenly found themselves included. Seen, valued. 16-year-old James Mitchell, whose family couldn't spare 50 cents, stood with tears streaming down his face. His friend Sarah Chen, who had told her parents the game didn't matter, was sobbing openly. Across the auditorium, over 1,000 students who had been preparing to be invisible were suddenly visible, suddenly included, suddenly part of something bigger than their family's financial struggles. Principal Brindley raised his hands for quiet, though it took several minutes for the cheering to die down. Elvis wanted me to tell you something, he said. He said nobody should ever have to pretend they don't want something just because they can't afford it. He said you all deserve to be part of this community, no matter what's in your family's wallet. He said Humes takes care of its own. The cheering started again, even louder this time. The E.H. Crump Memorial football game took place 2 weeks later. All 1,400 Humes High School students attended. For many it was just a football game. But for over 1,000 students it was something more profound. It was the first time they'd been included without having to hide their circumstances. The first time someone with power and money had remembered what it was like to be powerless and poor. The first time their school community had actually meant community. Not just for those who could afford it, but for everyone. Elvis didn't attend the game. He was on tour, performing in Louisiana, but his presence was felt in every cheer from the stands, in every moment of belonging experienced by students who were used to exclusion. James Mitchell, who had grown up in one of Memphis's poorest neighborhoods, would later become a teacher. He spent 40 years teaching at inner-city schools, and he made it his mission to ensure no student was ever excluded for financial reasons. "Elvis showed me that inclusion isn't about charity," James would say, decades later. "It's about dignity. It's about recognizing that every person deserves to be part of their community." Sarah Chen went on to become a social worker specializing in family poverty. She cited Elvis's gesture as the moment she understood that systemic change required people with resources to remember what it felt like to be without them. The story of Elvis buying tickets for 1,400 students spread throughout Memphis. The gesture was reported in local newspapers, and soon similar initiatives started appearing at other schools. A local businessman paid for 500 students to attend their school's homecoming dance. A church congregation funded field trips for an entire elementary school. Elvis's example had shown people that inclusion was possible, that communities could be truly communal if people with means remembered those without. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the students themselves. For the first time, many of them understood that their financial circumstances didn't define their worth. Being poor didn't mean being invisible. It didn't mean pretending you didn't want things. It didn't mean accepting exclusion as inevitable. Principal Brindley kept a copy of Elvis's check framed in his office for the rest of his career. Students who came in for counseling, who felt discouraged by their circumstances, who were considering dropping out because they felt they didn't belong, would see that check and hear the story. "One of our own made it," Brindley would tell them. "And when he did, he remembered us. He remembered you. That's what success really means. Using what you have to lift up others." Elvis continued to support Humes High School for the rest of his life. He funded music programs, donated equipment, and paid for trips and activities. But that first gesture, buying 1,400 tickets so nobody would be left out, remained his most meaningful contribution. It wasn't just about the money. It was about dignity, about inclusion, about refusing to accept that poverty should equal invisibility. Years later, in an interview, Elvis was asked about his charitable giving. The reporter wanted to know about the big donations, the headline-making gesture, but Elvis brought up the Humes High tickets. "That might have been the most important money I ever spent," Elvis said, "not because of the amount, but because of what it meant. I know what it feels like to be the kid who can't go. I know what it's like to pretend you don't care, because admitting you can't afford something hurts too much. Nobody should have to feel that way. We're supposed to take care of each other. That's what community means." The reporter pressed him, "But you bought tickets for students you'd never even met. Students who weren't even enrolled when you were there." "So," Elvis responded, "they went to Humes. That made them family. You don't abandon family just because you haven't met them yet." This philosophy guided Elvis's charitable work throughout his career. He gave away cars, paid medical bills, funded educations, always with the same principle: nobody should be left out because of circumstances beyond their control. His generosity became legendary, but those who knew him best understood it wasn't about publicity or image. It was about remembering what it felt like to be invisible, and ensuring others didn't have to experience that same shame. In 1977, when Elvis died, Humes High School held a memorial service. Students who had been there in 1957, now adults with children of their own, shared stories about the football game tickets. They talked about how that gesture had shaped their understanding of community, of responsibility, of success. One former student, now a business owner, stood and said, "Elvis taught me that making it isn't just about escaping poverty. It's about reaching back and pulling others up with you. It's about remembering where you came from and using your success to change things for people still there." Today, Humes High School has a plaque in its main hallway commemorating Elvis's donation. It reads, "In memory of Elvis Presley, class of 1953, who taught us that true success means ensuring nobody gets left behind." But the real memorial isn't the plaque. It's in the lives of those 1,400 students who learned that inclusion matters, that community means everyone, that dignity isn't determined by what's in your wallet. It's in the teachers they became, the social workers they trained as, the businesses they built with the principle that everyone deserves a seat at the table. And it's in the countless times over the decades since when someone with resources remembered Elvis's example and chose to include rather than exclude, to lift up rather than leave behind, to create true community rather than accept artificial divisions based on who can and cannot afford 50 cents. The legacy of that September day in 1957 extended far beyond the football game itself. The Crump Memorial Game became one of the most successful fundraisers for blind children in Memphis history, not just because of the attendance, but because Elvis's gesture had reminded the community what charity actually meant. Miss Mildred Scrivener, the English teacher who had given young Elvis a chance to perform in the talent show, was still teaching at Humes in 1957. When she heard about Elvis buying the tickets, she cried in her empty classroom. She'd always believed in quiet dignity over loud charity, in opportunities over handouts. Elvis had learned that lesson and scaled it to "That's my boy," she said to Principal Brindley. He always understood what mattered. The football game itself was memorable not for the score or the plays, but for the atmosphere. 1,400 Humes High students filled the stands, cheering together, belonging together, experiencing what community actually meant when everyone was included. The blind children who benefited from the fundraiser were brought onto the field at halftime, and the students gave them a standing ovation that lasted 5 full minutes. James Mitchell, sitting with his friends in those stands, felt something shift inside him. He'd spent so much of his life making himself small, invisible, preparing for exclusion. But here he was, surrounded by 1,399 other students, all of them there because someone had decided that inclusion mattered more than money. Someone had decided they mattered. "This is what it should always feel like," James said to his friend Sarah Chen. Sarah nodded, tears on her cheeks. Nobody left out, nobody pretending they don't care, just everyone together. That feeling, that understanding of what community could be, would shape both of their lives. James would go on to create scholarship programs at the schools where he taught, ensuring students could participate in every activity regardless of their family's finances. Sarah would advocate for systemic changes in how schools approached poverty, pushing for policies that eliminated participation fees entirely. They weren't alone. Across Humes High School, students who had been on the verge of dropping out because they felt they didn't belong, suddenly saw a different future. If Elvis Presley, who had been just as poor as them, could make it and then use his success to lift others up, maybe success was possible for them too. Maybe being poor wasn't a permanent identity. Maybe it was just a temporary circumstance that could be overcome. The dropout rate at Humes High School decreased by 30% over the next 3 years. Principal Brindley credited Elvis's gesture with changing the school's culture. Students felt like they mattered, Brindley explained to the school board. When kids feel like they matter, they show up, they try, they believe in themselves. But the impact wasn't just internal to Humes. Other schools in Memphis noticed what had happened and started questioning their own practices. Why were field trips optional when some students couldn't afford them? Why did proms cost money that excluded poor students? Why were school activities designed in ways that automatically left out significant portions of the student body? A movement started, quietly at first, then growing. Teachers began fundraising specifically to ensure full participation. Local businesses started sponsorship programs. Churches created activity funds for students whose families were struggling. The idea that poverty should equal exclusion began to be challenged in ways it hadn't been before. By 1960, Memphis City Schools had implemented a policy requiring that all school-sponsored activities either be free or have full scholarship options available. The policy was directly inspired by Elvis's gesture at Humes. No student should ever have to choose between participating in school life and helping their family make ends meet. The policy statement read, Elvis's own relationship with Humes High School deepened after the ticket purchase. He began visiting regularly when he was in Memphis, not for publicity events but just to talk with students. He'd sit in the cafeteria and ask about their dreams, their struggles, their hopes. He'd share his own stories about being poor, about being invisible, about the shame of poverty. Don't ever let anyone make you feel less than because you're struggling, Elvis would tell students. Your worth isn't determined by what you have. It's determined by who you are and how you treat people. Remember that. These visits weren't publicized. Elvis requested that the press not be notified. This wasn't about his image. This was about connection, about showing students that someone who had made it remembered what it was like to be where they were. One afternoon in 1959, Elvis sat with a group of juniors during their lunch period. One student, a quiet boy named Marcus Williams, finally worked up the courage to ask a question that had been bothering him. "Mr. Presley, why'd you really buy those tickets? Was it just to look good?" The other students gasped, worried that Marcus had been too direct. But Elvis just smiled. "You know what, Marcus? That's a fair question, and I appreciate you asking it straight." Elvis leaned forward. "I bought those tickets because I know what it feels like to pretend you don't want something just because you can't afford it. I know what it's like to make yourself invisible because you're ashamed of being poor. And I decided that if I ever had the chance, I'd make sure other kids didn't have to feel that way. But you didn't even know most of us," Marcus pressed. "We weren't here when you went to school." "Didn't matter," Elvis said. "You went to Hume's. That made you part of my community. And community means you take care of each other, especially when some people have more than others." Marcus nodded slowly, processing this. "So if I make it someday, if I get out of poverty, I should do the same thing." "That's up to you," Elvis said. "But I'll tell you what I think. I think success that doesn't help others isn't really success at all. It's just accumulation. Real success means using what you have to make things better for people who are still struggling. That's how communities move forward. That's how we all rise together instead of just a few people rising while everyone else stays stuck." This philosophy of collective advancement became central to Elvis's public image. But it wasn't a calculated brand strategy. It was authentic belief, born from lived experience, reinforced by memory of shame and exclusion. The students Elvis interacted with at Hume's carried his message forward. They became teachers, social workers, business owners, politicians, and many of them made decisions shaped by Elvis's example of inclusive community. Marcus Williams, the student who had asked Elvis the direct question, went on to become a city council member in Memphis. He championed policies aimed at reducing child poverty, increasing access to education, and ensuring community resources were available to everyone regardless of income. In his office, he kept a photograph of Elvis visiting Hume's High School, a reminder of the conversation that had shaped his understanding of public service. "Elvis taught me that leadership isn't about personal achievement," Marcus would later say. "It's about creating conditions where everyone can achieve. It's about dismantling the barriers that keep people invisible." The E.H. Crump Memorial football game continued for decades, becoming an institution in Memphis. And every year, the story of Elvis buying 1,400 tickets was retold, reminding new generations of students that inclusion matters, that dignity matters, that community means everyone. In 1972, Hume's High School created the Elvis Presley Inclusion Award, given annually to a student who demonstrated commitment to ensuring that no one in their community was left behind. The award came with a scholarship and a challenge: use your success to lift others up, just as Elvis had done. The first recipient was a senior named Patricia Johnson, who had organized a campaign to provide school supplies to students whose families couldn't afford them. In her acceptance speech, Patricia said, "Elvis showed us that you don't have to be rich to believe in inclusion. You just have to care enough to act. I'm not rich yet, but I can still make sure my classmates have what they need. That's what community means." Elvis attended that award ceremony, one of his last public appearances at Hume's before his death, and he shook Patricia's hand and told her, "You get it. You understand that it's not about waiting until you have everything to help others. It's about helping with what you have right now." That's how change happened. When Elvis died 5 years later, Hume's High School held a memorial service that drew thousands. Former students came from across the country, many of them now successful in their own right, all of them shaped by the culture of inclusion that Elvis had helped create. The memorial wasn't about mourning a celebrity. It was about honoring someone who had remembered his community even after achieving fame beyond imagination. Someone who had understood that true success meant bringing others along, not leaving them behind. Principal Brindley, retired by then but still beloved by generations of Hume's students, spoke at the memorial. Elvis Presley was many things, Brindley said. A revolutionary musician, a cultural icon, a movie star. But to those of us at Humes High School, he was something more fundamental. He was proof that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go, and he was proof that when you rise you can choose to bring others with you. The impact of Elvis's $1,050 donation cannot be measured just in the 1,400 students who attended that football game. It must be measured in the culture of inclusion that spread from that gesture, in the policies that were changed, in the lives that were shaped by the understanding that poverty shouldn't equal invisibility. It must be measured in teachers like James Mitchell, who spent 40 years ensuring no student was excluded, in social workers like Sarah Chen, who fought systemic poverty, in politicians like Marcus Williams, who crafted policies aimed at collective advance, in students like Patricia Johnson, who learned that you don't have to wait to be rich to help others. Today, when people talk about Elvis's legacy, they often focus on his music, his movies, his cultural impact. But for the students of Humes High School, particularly those 1,400 who were included in 1957 when they expected to be excluded, Elvis's legacy is simpler and more profound. He showed them that dignity matters, that inclusion matters, that community means that success isn't about escaping poverty, but about making sure others can escape too, that remembering where you came from isn't about nostalgia but about responsibility. And perhaps most importantly, he showed them that 50 cents shouldn't determine who belongs and who doesn't, that participation in community life is a right, not a privilege reserved for those who can afford. The plaque in Humes High School's hallway is still there, reminding each new generation of students about the day Elvis bought 1,400 tickets. But the real memorial is in the thousands of lives touched by that gesture, in the ripple effects that spread outward from one man's decision, that nobody should be left behind, in the ongoing work of creating truly inclusive communities where everyone matters, everyone belongs, and everyone has the chance to succeed.